Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and these are the video lecture notes for the Essential Standard 10.3.1, The Industrial Revolution in England. The essential question, why did England industrialize first? Next slide. There's our bubble map. The four headings are economic strength, geography and natural resources, population growth, and political stability. Next slide. The first section is entitled Economic Strength. By the mid-1600s, England was becoming a modern democratic nation. We discussed this in earlier standards, how England, starting with Magna Carta in the Middle Ages, made the transformation from being a monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. Next slide. England's political freedom led to economic freedom. These two things almost always go hand in hand. The more political freedom a country has for its people, the more economic freedom, there is. Next slide. Economics is the science of producing and distributing goods and services. Economics is not the easiest word to define. I like to say it's how people survive, how people make money, how people make a living. Next slide. Before the Industrial Revolution, the world's economic system was based on feudalism. Feudalism was an economic system whereby peasants and others would trade land for military service. Basically, the lord of the manor or the aristocrats owned the land, and that's the way it was throughout much of Europe in the Middle Ages and even after. Next slide. The Industrial Revolution began in England in the mid-1700s for a variety of reasons. Next slide. In the century that followed, factories and machines began to transform the world. So what started in England eventually spread around the world. Next slide. Instead of using hand tools to make products, people came to rely on machinery. Next slide. During the 1600s, overseas exploration had opened new markets for England, and this was part of the background to England setting the pace for industrialization later. Next slide. England developed a thriving economy based on money in the 1600s. Economic systems based on money, believe it or not, are relatively new. Before the Industrial Revolution, money was somewhat rare, and most people didn't rely on money to live on. We'll talk more about that later. Next slide. Britain's overseas empire became a great market for its manufactured goods. Places like the American colonies, for example, became vital in Britain's economic system. Next slide. British merchants invested money in new industries and put it to profitable use. And this money was used to invest in factories later. Next slide. Banks offered business loans that helped to trigger industrial growth. Next slide. The most famous early bank was the powerful Bank of England, which was established in 1694. Without banks, you can't have a modern economic system, as we'll see. Next slide. There's a video about the Industrial Revolution that you could watch. Next slide. The next section is entitled Geography and Natural Resources. England's rivers offered many advantages for industrialization. England has many rivers that can be navigated by boats, and these provided an excellent system of transportation in the early Industrial Revolution. Fast-flowing rivers were a source of water power. You notice here there's a water wheel, and this before electricity and before steam power powered some of the earliest factories. This is an early factory. Next slide. Rivers also provided inland transportation routes before the invention of the train and the automobile. the fastest way to transport goods was by river or canal. Next slide. In addition, England had excellent harbors for transporting things long distances. Harbors are places where the water is relatively deep next to the shore where big ships can dock and load and unload their cargoes. England has a lot of these, and it gave them an excellent advantage in industrializing. Next slide. Harbors are important for docking ships and the distribution of goods. Next slide. England has rich natural resources such as coal and iron. Next slide. Coal was a valuable source of energy in the early part of the Industrial Revolution. Coal was burned to heat water, to produce steam, to power the early steam engines. Next slide. Iron was important. It was used to make machines and eventually steel, and became the backbone of the early Industrial Revolution in terms of production. Next slide. West Central England became known as the, quote, Black Country, end quote, for its smog and also for its coal production. Next slide. The next section of this standard is entitled Population Growth. Scientific improvements in farming during the 1700s led to higher yields and healthier livestock, which eventually led to more food production. Next slide. An agricultural revolution, which was occurring side by side with the Industrial Revolution, brought more food for the people to eat. Next slide. And this is a seed drill, which was one of the early inventions of the Industrial Revolution. Next slide. Examples of this revolution include the seed drill, crop rotation, and the scientific breeding of animals. The seed drill allowed farmers to plant crops in rows, allowed them to cultivate and irrigate, and it increased the production of foods like corn and wheat. Crop rotation was a practice that had begun in the Middle Ages, whereby farmers would rotate crops on their land to eliminate or to mitigate the depletion of minerals in the soil. And the scientific breeding of animals allowed farmers to grow more cattle and sheep and higher yielding types of those. For example, cows that produced milk were bred scientifically for the first time, starting in the 1700s. Next slide. Health and living conditions improved during this period and population increased. Before the Industrial Revolution, the population of the world was somewhat less than a billion. And once the Industrial Revolution started, population started to rise and then rapidly rise as the centuries went on, largely because of better health, longer lifespans, and increased food supplies. Next slide. A larger population meant a greater demand for goods and more available labor. Next slide. The last heading of this section is entitled Political Stability. The last war on English soil was the English Civil War, which was fought in the middle of the 1600s. Next slide. England's businesses grew without much interference from the government. Back on the previous slide, I just wanted to say political stability means businesses could thrive and not worry about things like wars disrupting business. And England was very politically stable after the turmoil of the 1600s. Next slide. Due to these factors, the Industrial Revolution began in England. And like I said, it eventually spread around the world. And that's it for the Industrial Revolution's causes, Standard 10.3.1.